Chapter 5, Guns N' Roses. During my last year of addiction, my grandmother knew what was going on all right. After the Thanksgiving orgy, how could she not? But she also remained steadfast in her belief that I was going to survive. I wasn't so sure. One evening, I was at the apartment of a guy named Nick, a friend I had met during my brief time as a student at the University of Toledo. He brought along a girl named Kathy. As was often the case when I was involved, things deteriorated as I drank and drank. Part of this was told to me later by Nick and Kathy, but apparently at one point, while they were out of the room, I went rooting around and found the 9mm handgun Nick had kept in his home for protection. The pistol was loaded, and so was I. He and Kathy returned to find me sitting on the couch with the barrel of the gun in my mouth, my finger on the trigger. I took it out, smiled at them, and put it back in. At that point, Nick grabbed the gun out of my hand. When Kathy told me the story later, she said it was one of the scariest and saddest moments of her life. Scary because she had realized that had Nick not taken action, I very well might have splattered my brains all over his apartment. Sad because she began to glimpse the depths of depression and pain I must have felt to reach such a point. I had guns on my mind for a while after that. At one point I contacted a guy I knew who could get me a gun cheap. I told him I needed it for self-defense. He came by Granny's one night when I was wasted, and I told him something about how this would be great to use to blow my head off. But I couldn't come through with the scratch. No money, no mind-blowing gun. Being broke that night might have saved my life. Would I have pulled the trigger if I had been able to buy the gun, or if Nick hadn't pulled it out of my hands at his apartment? To this day, I'm not sure. I had reached the depth of my addiction and self-loathing. On the other hand, it is precisely at these times, when things seem as if they can't get any worse, that addicts begin to turn the corner. Maybe it's because we can feel ourselves touching bottom and recognize that either we must now rise or die. Maybe it's a self-defense mechanism, whereby the last vestige of rational thought in the brain summons up its strength for one final cry, "Stop!" Or maybe it's just weariness. Whatever the reasons, at just about the point where I felt I could get no more depraved, no more depressed, things began to turn around. It was April 12th, 1993, early spring in the Midwest. I was working for a construction contractor at the time. I had spent the day at work in a hot, cramped garage, tearing up a cement floor with a jackhammer. That afternoon when I got home from work, I started drinking, as usual. To celebrate my dad's birthday, although hardly in the manner that he would have approved of, I hit the bottle extra hard. The next morning, I remember groggily looking outside, seeing the sun rising over the 10-mile creek behind Granny's house. It was going to be a beautiful day. Too nice for me to work, I decided. Instead, I decided to devote my full attention to inebriation. I kept drinking right through the day and into the evening when some friends of mine and I had tickets to see Guns N' Roses in Detroit. We drank, we snorted blow, and for some good measure, I took some pills on the way to the arena that night. At some point between Axl Rose's first shimmy and scream and Slash's final power chord of the night, I blacked out. My friends found me later after the show, passed out outside the arena with no shirt on, my pants unbuttoned, leaning up against a pole with a girl next to me. I awoke the next morning, got in my car, and drove to a local bar. From 10:30 to noon, I downed one shot after another. Then I got into my car and started driving aimlessly around Sylvania. Suddenly, I felt my car lurch. Craning my neck out the window, I could see I had a flat tire. I pulled over at a local Jiffy Lube, asked to use the phone, and called my buddy Larry to have him come pick me up. While doing so, I pulled my pants down and urinated all over the manager's desk. You never saw people move so fast, even in a Jiffy Lube. Customers scattered, mechanics ran over from the service area to see what was going on, and the manager called the cops. I blew a .284 blood alcohol level, well over the legal limit, and they promptly arrested me. The cops also knew I was doing more than drinking. "Where are the drugs, Todd?" one officer asked me. "I took them all," I replied. The cop slapped me with a DUI and pounded my car and put me in a holding cell. Larry, who had showed up in time to witness the chaos at the Jiffy Lube, followed us down to the police station and eventually was able to bail me out. As I left, I yelled at the cops for not letting me take my 6-pack of Moosehead beer that had been in my car. Larry took me back to Granny's, where I got back on the phone to ask another friend to pick up some booze and come over. This guy showed up a little later with a fifth of vodka, beer, and oh boy, crack. It was during that night that I finally had that moment of self-discovery that I had been waiting for since I slugged down that first sip of beer, which was poison for someone with my risk factors, back in the 8th grade. Why did it happen then? No one knows. Why did it not happen earlier in my life as an addict? Or later? No one knows that either. But it did happen then, thank goodness. Sadly, not all addicts are so fortunate. With it happening, suddenly I was on the road to recovery, even though I only barely realized it at the time. I was surely lucky that I did realize it. Addicts who are going to recover have to, at some level, be ready for the realization that they really want to stop, must stop, if and when it does come. I drank and smoked on and off the rest of that night. As the night went on, my disgust over what had transpired the previous 2 days grew and grew. However, instead of sentencing myself to slow death by poison, my usual self-loathing response, this time I slowly began to turn the anger toward the poison itself, toward the alcohol and drugs, and my inability to deal with them. That was the real problem, I began to see. If I could control that, I could control my life. And I wanted life, I realized, not death. Despite all my dramatic gunplay, despite the drunken, overwrought speeches about how I wished my mother had taken me with her, what I really wanted was to go on living. I wanted to feel good, have a sense of purpose, start a healthy relationship, build a career. I was tired of being perceived, by myself as well as others, as a loser, a drunk, a troublemaker. Understand, of course, that this realization came fitfully over 5 or 6 hours. I cursed the booze as I was sipping it. Still, the sips got farther and fewer as the night wore on, like an engine of self-destruction slowly running out of steam. The next morning, a strange but soothing feeling came over me, different from the bitter, melancholy state I usually found myself in near the end of a long binge. Around that time, my grandmother came down and sat quietly next to me. It was almost as if she knew instinctively that something important was going to happen, something besides me puking or passing out, and wanted to be there to support me. At about noon on April 15th, 1993, I drained my last glass of beer and declared, "I don't want this anymore. I'm done." I knew at that moment I had taken my last drink. Knew it with the same savage conviction that had kept me drinking and taking drugs relentlessly for the previous 13 years. That addictive energy had been rerouted, almost as if a circuit switch had been flipped in my brain. Now I was suddenly passionate and determined to get sober and stay that way. The fog of about 12 hours, or was it all 13 years, of drinking began to dissipate. I was rational. I was clear. I had just taken my first tentative step on the road to recovery. Some might say it was high time, pardon the pun. I had nothing at this point. No money, no family except Granny, and only a few real friends. My credit was ruined. I was in poor health. I had no job, no future at all. What I did have was a full heart. This is what you must have to achieve sobriety. The desire to do what you must in order to get and remain sober. I wasn't quite sure what that would entail yet, but already I was confident that I could achieve it. I was not alone in this. In 2005, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism reported on a study that found more than 1/3, 35%, of U.S. adults with alcoholism are in recovery. I don't know how many of them made the decision in quite the same circumstances that I did after a 3-day binge that included a stint in jail, not to mention a heavy metal concert, but that doesn't matter. It's a point often overlooked by society that many alcoholics and drug abusers can and do recover and go on to lead successful lives. A lot of them have been helped by 12-step programs, such as Alcoholics Anonymous. Although, as I would discover later, there are other recovery tools, techniques, and approaches that can be successfully used as well. My first stop after I decided to stop was the local AA chapter. I didn't need to look it up in the phone book. I had been there before. Like many addicts, I had been ordered to AA meetings to avoid further jail time during some of my earlier scrapes with the law. Some respond well to being force-fed into the program. I didn't. I remember sitting in the meetings and thinking what a drag it was. How boring. Who cared what these old dried-up drunks had to say? Also, It bothered me how many of them were puffing on cigarettes and how choked with smoke the room was. I don't need to get lung cancer to quit drinking, I groused to a friend at the time. In sum, I felt uncomfortable at AA the couple of times that I had been compelled to go. Then again, I felt uncomfortable almost every place in my life up to that point, save maybe a bar stool or in front of some lines of coke. This time was different. I couldn't wait to get back to AA, smoke or no. This time I was eager to learn everything I could from this, the original 12-step program. For once, I shut my mouth, watched and listened to what these people had to say, and how they had managed to achieve sobriety in their lives. I had heard some of the AA canon before, about admitting your powerlessness over alcohol, about believing in something greater than yourself. But now it was making sense. I wanted what these people had, sobriety, a new life, and so I hung on every word. In a 12-step meeting, lots of people talk and share their experiences. Although I tried to learn something from everyone there, I wasn't quite as interested in the casual user or the yuppie whose drinking got a little out of hand. In AA, and soon in the related 12-step meetings for cocaine users that I began attending, I was interested in the real hardcore addicts and people like me, so that I could say, okay, he was a mess like I am now, but he recovered, and so can I. Such a guy was Carl, whom I met in a Cocaine Anonymous meeting. Carl was an older blue-collar guy, not some three-piece suit businessman who had developed a fondness for the blow and had to attend these meetings to save his six-figure job or because a judge had ordered him to. In the past, Carl had screwed up as badly as I had, and for as long as I had. When Carl spoke, there was no BS, no sob stories, and no excuses. But there was hope. Carl talked about a newfound confidence in himself, about a lengthy sobriety, about a life that had improved, about new friends, or at least non-using friends, about a life in which drugs did not play a part. I was drawn to this. I remember sitting there one night listening to him, and it almost seemed as if he was sketching out a roadmap for me. Life doesn't have to be this way, he said. You can beat the addiction. I did. You can too. I began to realize he was right, but to do that, I also had to understand it. As the days went on, a few things became clearer to me. I could see that in many ways, the ongoing dissolution was, in addition to whatever genetic traits I possessed, due large in part to my desire to throw myself my own little pity party. I was feeling sorry for myself, angry about my mother and my family situation, and later angry and ashamed at being kicked off the team and out of school. And the party just kept going on and feeding itself. I was getting drunk and high out of self-pity and embarrassment over things I had done while I was getting drunk and high. A stupid, as well as vicious cycle. I began to see this pattern, and I recognized that having a drink or snorting some blow was not going to make anything better, just worse. In AA, I also learned that it was okay to admit powerlessness. A lot of addicts are full of bravado. I certainly was. The more poison I could put into my body, the better, I always thought. I could handle it. I was in control of it. Of course, I was not. My life was desperately out of control. That's what had led me to these meetings. I faced the fact that alcohol and drugs had won. I remember in one meeting, someone had said, "How many times do you have to get your butt kicked by Mike Tyson to realize you're not going to beat him?" As an ex-athlete, that made a lot of sense to me. It was a fine line between determination and futility, between trying my best to defend the net against Wayne Gretzky and admitting he was just too fast for me to stop. Alcohol had KO'd me, shut me down, and sent me to the showers. Embarrassed me the way Gretzky would have on the ice or Tyson would have in the ring. That was a hard thing for me to accept, but doing so was a big step toward recovery. Gradually, over the course of that spring and summer, things began to come together for me. I was beginning to learn the truth of what I tell addicts today. Recovery is like building a house. You don't start with the roof, you start with a solid foundation. That solid foundation is getting sober. As with everything else in my life, I jumped into sobriety with both feet. In addition to the meetings, I had the support of good friends, such as Robin. Robin had been there. She was a recovering addict and very active in local support groups. I knew her and I trusted her. Robin became my own support group. She'd come over to my grandmother's house, a much quieter and healthier place since I had put down that last beer, and we'd talk for hours about life without drugs and alcohol and how to attain it. I also read a lot about recovery and the various theories of how and why people become addicts. This was fascinating to me, as if I were reading an owner's manual from my own head. Of course, those of us trying to build a new life still have to deal with the ramifications of the old one. That summer, I went to court for my third DUI charge, the Jiffy Lube incident that helped spark my recovery. The judge listened as my attorney explained that I had been attending AA meetings and that I was serious about sobriety. Then again, he probably heard the same things from lots of other addicts who were then back in his court in a few months, this time having robbed or killed someone. He sentenced me to 3 days in jail, 33 days of work release, which meant that I had to do some menial job during the day and then sleep in jail at night, a 1-year suspension of my driver's license, plus a year's probation. The last part of the sentence I didn't mind. They could have made the probation 20 years for all I cared. I knew in my heart I was done with my old way of living. But jail sucked. For my 3-day incarceration, I was sent to the Corrections Center of Northwest Ohio in Stryker, a town in the western part of the state near the Indiana border. My first night there, I was going through the food line for dinner. As I was getting my mashed potatoes slopped down on my plate, the guy behind the counter said, "Hey Todd, how you doing?" I looked up and saw this fellow inmate was an old drug buddy of mine. Man, I thought, it's a bad situation when people in jail start recognizing you. While I had confidence that I was now on the road to beating my addiction, others were skeptical. As I was leaving Stryker, my 3-day sentence served, one of the guards called out to me, "Hey Todd, we'll see you again here soon." I stiffened up when I heard that, turned around, and said to him coolly and very slowly, in my best read my lips voice, "You will never see me here again." And they haven't. The second phase of my incarceration was 33 days at the Lucas County Work Release Program in Toledo. During the day, I spent my time pushing a broom in a warehouse alone and bored out of my mind. At night, I was back in jail, listening to the snoring and mutterings of 50 other miscreants. I'd wake up there in the morning, eat breakfast there, shower there. It was degrading and humiliating to go back to this situation every night. I kept sane for that month by telling myself that I wouldn't have to do this stuff forever. I was paying for my mistakes. It was particularly hard when my dad came to visit. He and I had plenty of problems in our relationship, between my mother's suicide and her, quote, role in my addiction, not to mention the problems I had caused him and his second wife. It would take years to sort things out with both Terry Crandall and my stepmother. Like any parent-child relationship, there's guilt, anger, baggage. Given what had happened with my mother and everything I later put my father and stepmother through, you can just imagine the size of the Crandall family's baggage train. Not long after I was released from the work program, I decided I wanted to return to school. I went back to the judge and asked for driving privileges so I could attend classes at the University of Toledo. He looked at my attendance record at the AA and Cocaine Anonymous meetings, read the glowing reports from my probation officer, and I think saw that I was serious about sobriety. He agreed to my request, and I was able to drive to classes. Because I was so committed to a program of self-improvement in every aspect of my life, college was a godsend, a key part in my striving to become a, quote, normal person. This is what sober people do. This is what people who don't have a 13-year history of addiction do, I thought. They go to school, they work, they get a job. Classes were fun and challenging, a far cry from pushing a broom. Also, for the first time, I was hearing things at school and in the meetings with a clear head. This is something people who are not continually drunk or stoned may not appreciate. Think about how you might feel when you have the flu or have just come out of anesthesia. This is more or less the state that I walked around in for 13 years. Now the fog was lifted. I was hearing, seeing, and understanding things with a new perspective. In addition to learning about marketing channels and sales management, I learned how to use a computer. I learned how to type. Basic life skills for what was basically a new life. In the spring of 1994, I completed that associate degree in sales and marketing. I was really proud and was ready to take the next step in my recovery. The judge knew about my sincere efforts to straighten out, but a lot of others didn't. That was deliberate. I did not tell anyone that I had stopped drinking, as I had a couple of times in the past, when my sobriety lasted about 72 hours. This time, I decided I would let my actions speak for me, Believe me, my actions needed a good spokesperson. I'd angered and hurt a lot of people, damaged a lot of relationships over the years. On April 15th, 1994, 1 year to the day after I put down that last beer, I called my friend Kevin, who grew up in Sylvania and had known me through the years. I said, "Hey, I'm sober a year today." He said, "Big deal. Let me know when you have 5. It was a necessary slap in the face. He wasn't trying to dismiss my efforts at staying sober. What he was saying was, "You're sober for a year, but you were a raging, drunk, out-of-control lunatic for 13 years, so you've still got a long way to go to earn our trust back." That comment stung at first, but he was right. I still had a lot to prove, a lot to learn. One of the key lessons was the importance of help. They tell you right away in AA meetings, you need support, you need help. This went against the cocky Crandall grain. Help? Goalies didn't need help. They did it on their own, man against man on the ice. But over the course of my first year of sobriety, I realized that I did need help, beyond what my friends and support group members could provide. Help arrived in the form of a beautiful blonde wearing a white t-shirt with a yellow sunflower on it. She was sitting on the sofa in the apartment of a girl I happened to be dating. The girl introduced me to Melissa, and I knew in an instant I was in love. Melissa was from Huntsville, Ohio, and had come to Toledo to attend the university. When I met her, she was contemplating moving back to Huntsville because her lease was almost up. She liked hockey, she was a good listener, and although a bit shy, she was rock solid in her support of me and what I was doing. It took a while, as we were both dating other people at the time we met, but eventually I got the nerve to ask her out. Our dates were pretty tame. I remember we'd watch a lot of TV together. Melrose Place was our favorite. While I was extremely attracted to her, my goal wasn't to get her in bed at the very first possible moment, which had been the case with most of the other women I dated. I just liked her company. She heard my life story, listened to my confessions about my anguish, about my mother, about how I had basically tried to kill myself for 13 years, and she didn't flinch. Unlike a lot of other people, Melissa wasn't hung up on what I had done in my past, but rather what I was going to do in my future. I knew the future had to include her. As we dated, I began to behave like the gentleman I never had been in previous relationships. I even brought her roses from time to time. On December 23rd, 1995, a year and a half after my last drink, I proposed to her in the front seat of my Honda Civic. She said yes, and it was the closest feeling I had had to a buzz since my final bender.